All right, well, good morning, everybody, and thank you all so much for being here. Our presentation this morning is called Welcome to the Zoo, A Guide to Wildlife Photography, presented by Erica Robinson, who's with Tamron Photography. This event and all of our photography virtual events are presented by Hunts Photo and Video. Normally, Gary Farber's here to kind of talk about hunts a little bit. Unfortunately, he can't be with us this morning, so I'll put a little blurb in there and a link to Hunt's Photo and Video in that email I send out later today. They've got a lot of great prices on stuff, so I always encourage you to check them out. And Gary's a great resource too. If you ever have any questions, he's a great person to contact. And so about our presentation today, a little bit about our presenter, Erica Robinson. She's always had a really strong passion for both photography and travel. But it was when she merged the two together is when she found her true passion. She studied photography in college, and her first adventure was working as a photographer for a cruise line out on the ships. Trying to pursue a different genre, she then worked with talented Boston wedding photographers while learning the technical side of working for a local camera store. Photography is an incredible tool that allows us to stop a moment and relive it every time we look at that image. Erica enjoys teaching and others how to capture that moment and how to relive it over and over again. And so with that, I will turn it over to Erica. And again, I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I will be back to talk to y'all here in a little bit. Take it away, Erica.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for the intro. Before I go on, though, I want to make sure, Andrew, do you want to do the rebate, or do you want me to wait till the end for the rebate?
Yeah, we can just talk about it at the end when we wrap up. I think that's fine.
Okay, cool. Just check. All right. So yes, thank you so much for the intro. My name is Erica Robinson. I am a field services specialist with Tamron. I've actually been with Tamron for almost 10 years, 10 years in January. So celebrating a big number soon. And I absolutely love what I do. I love being able to educate. I love being able to see that little spark go off in a photographer's eyes when they've learned something new. And so I hope that if anything, you pick up one thing today, or that you are simply inspired to go out and learn something new about wildlife or go out and photograph. So if anything, I really just hope that you are inspired throughout this presentation. Today, as you know, we are talking about wildlife photography. We are trying to figure out the best way to make these photos and the best way to enjoy ourselves, right? So throughout this, I want to make sure that you don't forget that photography is supposed to be fun. You're supposed to enjoy this, right? It doesn't have to be a daunting chore. And if you find that it's becoming a daunting chore, step away from your camera for a minute and then come back to it once you can be in that good headspace again, okay? So wildlife photography specifically, as these guys have already mentioned, I've worked in a lot of different genres of photography, and wildlife is something that I've always really enjoyed because I really enjoy learning about the wildlife, not just photographing them. I enjoy learning about their behaviors, how they eat, how they sleep, their breeding season. I just recently learned, and somebody can probably correct me more on this, but I found it fascinating. I learned that mergansers, the hooded mergansers, the bird, they have the ability to, they have specialized vision where they can change the shape of their corneas and their lenses to correct for light refraction. So it helps them both when they're above water and below water. And I just thought that was absolutely incredible, right? So there are all these little things that wildlife can do, and we can really learn from them in the real world, so, or in our world. So all of those things I think are really important for us to pay attention to. I don't know why my screen's not advancing. Hold on. There we go. Okay. Sorry. So if you see me with my phone, I'm not texting or scrolling through Instagram. I'm using it to try and control my monitor. So bear with me on that. Sometimes it decides to work, sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, this is the list that we are going to go through today. We're going to start with why go to the zoo in the first place, why go to these zoos, sanctuaries, aquariums, and how we get to know them best. We're going to talk about packing and bringing the right equipment, because there are certainly things that we would bring on location for this particular genre of photography that I wouldn't bring to go photograph a wedding, right? So we're going to talk about some equipment. We do always need to be looking for the light. So we're going to talk about how light and paying attention to that can help us create better photos. We're going to talk about better camera settings. We're going to talk about composition because we can talk about the technical stuff until we're blue in the face. But if we don't have proper approach to our composition, there's no oomph, there's no excitement in our photographs. We're trying to evoke emotion in our photos, and the best way to do that is through composition. And then, of course, we will bring up the ever daunting question of how we photograph through a fence. And these are just your two little reminders at the end here to be patient and have fun. Okay. All right. So first and foremost, why do we go to the zoo? Why do we photograph at these places? Why do we go to sanctuaries and aquariums? And I think everybody has different reasons for this. So I put up between this slide and the next slide 4 different reasons that I think are important. And if you have other reasons, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. If you have a specific zoo or sanctuary or aquarium that you like, also please feel free to drop that in the chat box because I think people can really gain some knowledge from that. So my 4 reasons, first is to practice. It's to practice, to hone in my skills, to be in a more controlled environment, to a place that is a little bit more predictable than being out in the wild. So I can get used to that space if I decide to ever go out on a safari or on location for a specific bird. I can hone in my skills in a more controlled, understood environment. Second is because I can get intimate details of unique subjects that are often difficult to find in the wild, or it simply might be out of budget. There's not always easy access to places, and maybe if I'm not physically capable of going to those places, it's easier for me to get to a zoo or a sanctuary or aquarium. So they really offer me the ability to access the wildlife that I still want to photograph without having to go too far. My other couple of reasons here is to document the human and wildlife interactions. I'm always really intrigued when we go to sanctuaries specifically where there have been rehabilitated wildlife that are still interacting with people. Maybe we get to feed them. Maybe there's a petting zoo. Maybe there's something there where we can interact with them. And I'm always interested just to watch the human and the wildlife interactions. More specifically, the kids. I love watching kids interact with wildlife because they are just these little sponges that are so interested and so intrigued by everything. And they also come from such a gentle place with it typically. And so it's really beautiful to watch. And lastly, is to show the importance of conservation through impactful imagery. We can do really, really important things with our photographs. We can tell incredible stories that help people understand the stories of these wildlife, of them in nature, how they exist, why they exist, what we can do to help protect them. And so I think that's really important within our wildlife images. It's not just that we are creating these maybe portraits of these beautiful animals, but how we can help protect them in the future. Okay, so next up, we're going to talk about knowing our location, understanding the differences between the zoo, the sanctuary, the aquarium, and how it might help us make better photographs. I do truly believe that the more research that we do, the better we know our cameras, the better we know our location, the better we know our wildlife, the better pictures we're going to make. And that shows in our pictures later on. So I am a big fan of maps, and that's, might be very nerdy, but I think it's really important, whether I'm going out on location to photograph the night sky in the middle of a national park, or whether I'm going to a zoo that already has a pre-made map for me. I think these are really important. I want to plan a route around the specific wildlife that I want to see that day to make sure that I check off all of my boxes. So I haven't started at the east end of the zoo when everything that I want to see is on the west end of the zoo, right? Because otherwise I'm going to have put in all of this time and effort to go there and not actually photograph what I want to photograph. I also want to make sure that I'm checking for camera, tripod, and bag restrictions because some places do have weight limits on what you're allowed to bring or size limits on your bag. Some places don't allow you to bring a monopod or a tripod. And typically, I'm not taking a tripod out to a zoo or a sanctuary or an aquarium. Um, if anything, I'm taking a monopod to help hold a little bit of that extra weight sometimes of my heavy equipment. But you do want to check the restrictions to make sure you can bring them with you. And we want to think about checking for feeding times, checking for when there might be a specific event happening. We want to be there for that, right? We don't want to have missed it by 5 minutes and have to come back the week later, right? So check for those feeding times. I also want to think about when during the day and when during the year I want to be there. And while that might seem like it kind of comes second nature to us, not always, right? We think we just have the whole day available, but I think it's best to be there during the morning when you get there as soon as the zoo opens, or as soon as the sanctuary opens. Tends to be the less crowded. It's also going to be cooler in the morning. So typically animals are going to be more active in the morning in those cooler hours, right? So those are two things that we want to make sure we note as well. Of course, now I say that, but depending on the wildlife that we are photographing, there of course is certain wildlife that's going to be more active during the warmer times, right? So butterflies are cold-blooded. They're going to be more active during the hotter times, during 60, 70, 80 plus weather. So if I can get there during the colder times, it's better to photograph them because they're not all flittering around and I can actually catch them stopped on a leaf or on a branch or something. So this is again another reminder to know the behaviors and understand your wildlife so that you have the best opportunity to photograph them. Um, and when we go in the morning, so keeping kind of on that note here, when we go early in the morning or when we go in off season, we tend to have better opportunities to interact with staff. And if we can interact with staff a bit, we can learn more about those behaviors and about those wildlife. And maybe when there's certain events and special things happening. I think it's also, uh, I also encourage you to talk to the people that are around you there, not just be so honed in that you're paying attention to just the wildlife there. Everyone who's working there has really unique stories and they care about wildlife just as much, if not more, even than we do. So learning from them, I think, is really important. Heading out to an aquarium. An aquarium can offer a really unique perspective because we don't have to have the underwater housing and the massive lights and equipment that it can take to photograph in an underwater space. Um, the one thing, or two things, of course, that we have to watch out for is the reflective glass and the low light. So a lot of times we are going to be finding ourselves in more low light situations when we are in aquariums. And so we're going to have to be kicking up our ISOs quite a bit. And we'll talk about this a little more later on, but we want to make sure that we are as close as we can be to the glass itself so that we can avoid any of those extra reflections from lights in the background. And sanctuaries. So there's definitely a difference between all of these places that we are heading out to photograph. Traditionally, zoos are going to have smaller enclosures and potentially more wildlife, but smaller areas for them to be. When we're out in a sanctuary, we have more natural settings. So we're going to find more natural backgrounds, have much better backgrounds in our photos, sometimes have better light because it's more natural light. There's places, I think like there's one out by me in California, Safari West, that has big open air vehicles that you get to drive around in. There's one that I was at recently in Florida, the St. Augustine Alligator Farm, I think it was. That's all also open air with these nice trekking paths that walk through it. And so these places that have rehabilitated animals and have this great sanctuary space offer us more of a natural atmosphere to be able to photograph the wildlife. And of course, like I mentioned, I really like to have that human interaction every once in a while. I think that it's nice to make sure that we remember that we are also part of the animal world, and all of these interactions can be not only informative to us, but can be really informative to everyone who hasn't been able to get to these spaces themselves, right? How people get to interact with them. Now, there are, of course, also birds of prey centers. I know most people in this room are birders, so you guys probably know where all of them are much better than I do. And you've probably been out to some of the ones where you get to photograph birds in flight, which is great. There are some pros and cons to being able to photograph at them. Typically, you're going to have some really fast flying birds, so you have to make sure you know your camera very well. Um, a lot of times there's not necessarily the best backgrounds unless they have larger spaces for them to roam because their enclosures are made for the animals and their safety. They're not made to be conducive for photographers. So that's something to keep in mind too. All right, moving on to a little bit, we're going to talk about some equipment. Um, We're going to talk about a camera bag first, and what might be more effective for this type of photography. Then we're going to talk about some cameras and lenses. I'm not going to go through every lens that Tamron makes because there are a lot of them. And there's no one perfect lens for everyone. Everyone photographs differently, right? So what lens works for me might not work for someone else, and vice versa. We have to figure out how we see the world and what lenses work best for us. So I'll go through a few of my favorites and then we'll go from there. Then we're going to talk about some accessories, polarizers, neutral densities, monopods, and this is just a friendly reminder to please make sure you bring plenty of media, so memory cards, and plenty of batteries. You don't want to have gotten out there and figure out that you haven't formatted your cards yet and have only brought that one because then you're kind of SOL and have no way to photograph for the day, right? So make sure that you have plenty of media. I also know that our memory cards can hold like a cajillion photographs at this point, but if we go out there with just one memory card and it unfortunately goes defective or gets corrupt, which can certainly happen, while it's not often, we want to make sure we have a second one for backup. And then batteries, more specifically, if you're out on cooler days, colder mornings, having a second battery kind of tucked away inside a pocket, maybe close to your body, that way it has a little extra warmth, it will tend to last a bit longer. All right, so jumping back to the beginning of that list, this is a really old photograph, and also this is why we take pictures with our cameras sometimes, and our cell phones aren't going to do the greatest job. You can see the color difference that was photographed right there in the same second, but for some reason it got it different. But anyway, this is just for an example. I digress. We want to make sure that we are traveling with a comfortable camera bag that day. This is what I used to travel with when I was going out backpacking, camping, and hiking. And I was carrying like 35 pounds worth of camera gear. But I could never find a backpack that worked for me. Backpacks at the time, there weren't really any that fit or were comfortable for, I'm only 5 feet tall, so like small 5 foot tall women. They just simply didn't work for us. And so there's no rule that says you have to use a camera specific backpack. You can use any backpack that works for you. And I was using these inserts made by, I think, Tenba at the time. Think Tank makes a bunch of them. Low Pro, I think, makes some too. There's lots of different brands out there. But these inserts that would slide into my camera bag, and then I could customize it the way I wanted to for whatever I was going to shoot that day. I also did that with a couple of my small shoulder bags, like my messenger bags. Those smaller bags are usually what I tend to take on zoo trips or aquarium trips or sanctuary trips when I'm only wanting to carry one or two lenses. I'm wanting to go light, and I don't necessarily need to bring my tripod and a whole bunch of extra things with me. Um, so I tend to still use something smaller, but I can still use these inserts for those messenger bags. So just make sure you are using what's comfortable for you, because what's comfortable for you is going to be most efficient for your day. The last thing you want to do is be kind of like fishing around for batteries and cards because you don't know what pocket you put them in, and just makes it easier if you know your equipment well. Okay, so a few lenses here. Like I said, there's there's no right or wrong way to go about this. There are tons of lens options out there, and the lenses that work for me might not work for somebody else, and vice versa. So we want to make sure that we know what lenses work for our photography style specifically. If you are somebody that would prefer to travel with one lens, not have to change anything out during the day, not have to worry about sand getting in there if I'm down the beach or whatever that is, Tamron does some really great all-in-one lenses, and those are lenses that are kind of like they're like the jack of all trades, right? They do a little bit of everything. They give you a nice wide focal length. This one specifically starts at 18, and then they give you a telephoto focal length and goes all the way out to 300 millimeters. So it is going to be a variable aperture, but you're going to get the ability to have more versatile focal lengths throughout the day and not change out your lenses. So all-in-one lenses tend to be a really good option for these types of spaces. Of course, some of the first lenses that we look into, though, are our telephoto lenses. The 70 to 300 here, and then the 50 to 400 are both for our mirrorless systems. The 50 to 400, I love. It's one of my favorite lenses, and I think it's also because it has this little hidden talent where it has a 1 to 2 macro ratio at the 50 end. So it just is incredibly versatile in my eyes. So that's that 50 to 400. For DSLR lenses, the 100 to 400, and then the 150 to 600, those are going to be your telephoto options, right? Allowing you to really pull in that wildlife from a pretty far distance, right? Those tend to be the first lenses that we look to when we're going to photograph wildlife. However, I don't want us to forget about the other options that we have and the other ways that we can approach and view our wildlife. I almost always have a macro lens with me, not just to photograph the tiny wildlife, not just for the bugs and the bees and all that, but also for the details, right? So if I am at a sanctuary and I can get something up nice and close, a lot of my lenses can't get in this close. I want to make sure that I have a macro lens where I can hone in on all those little tiny details, right? And our wide angle lenses. So we forget about wide angle lenses a lot because we think we have to pull in that wildlife from really far away. But what happens when we have giant schools of fish? What happens when we have big colonies of bats? What happens when we have when we want to see more in that space, right? These are the examples for when we need a wide angle lens as well. A couple of accessories. Your circular polarizer is going to be really important, not just for your landscape photography when you're out there doing landscapes, but also for your for wildlife, because you want to reduce some of the glare that's out there. If you are photographing through glass or through plastic, a lot of times you have that glare. So you want to get up as close as you can to the glass itself. That way you avoid all of those reflections. Your polarizer can really help you there. However, when you are at an aquarium in darker spaces, you want to be careful with that polarizer because you can lose between a stop and a half of light because it's a darker filter. So just make sure you're paying attention to that as well. And a monopod. So, like I mentioned earlier, I'm not one to usually take a tripod with me when I'm going to a local zoo or something, just because they tend to be quite a bit cumbersome and I'm not doing too many long exposures, so don't really find the need for it. But having a monopod sometimes, if I'm carrying around heavier equipment for the day, is going to be really helpful so that the monopod bears the weight of all of the structure and not me. But again, you just want to make sure that you check the restrictions of the specific zoo that you're going to, because a lot of them don't allow it. All right, so we're going to move into some lighting conditions. We don't have photography without light. Light is incredibly important. It helps direct our viewer into understanding what the most important parts of our photograph are and the story that we're trying to tell them. So we really need to be paying attention to where the light is coming from, where that light is hitting, and making sure that our subject is the main thing that's providing or that's receiving a lot of that light. Okay. So that just means we need to pay attention, right? And that's really all it is. It can sound kind of daunting, but all it is looking. It's just watching where that light is coming from. And when we get really overwhelmed with it, I've seen a lot of photographers that will literally just put out their hand, the back of their hand, and follow it around and see where the light is on their hand, right? So when we're looking at too big of a scene, sometimes we can get really overwhelmed. And so to take it a step back, put out your hand, rotate around with your hand and you can watch where the light lands specifically. Okay, so we can see if we have this front direct light, we can see if we have backlight, whatnot. So I'm going to go through some examples just so you can get a good visual. We are all visual learners after all. This is some really nice front direct light, kind of middle of the day direct light. This is also some front direct light, but we have some overcast. And so because we have that overcast, it almost sits like there's a flash. And when you put your flash on your camera and you point that flash directly at something, it only lights up the thing in front of you and everything else behind it is dark, right? So in this particular situation, we had kind of a soft overcast day, but the light specifically was coming down right here on the wildlife and not as much in the background. So it gave us this nice dark background for this eagle to pop out on. To make it even more dramatic, right? Same type of situation where we have some really heavy direct dynamic light on the subject itself, but not as much in the background. So since we are metering and exposing for our subject, for the flamingo in this case, everything behind it is going to be dark, right? It really helps that subject pop in my picture. One of the times that I really enjoy photographing wildlife is during those heavy overcast days. Heavy overcast days just give us that nice diffused overall diffused look from our background to our foreground to the wildlife. It still allows us to get that nice catch light in the wildlife's eyes, something that helps that wildlife come to life a bit more, but it's not contrasty. So we don't have to worry about those kind of heavy shadows in places. In people, when you're photographing them in heavy light, you have those dark circles under people's eyes and that little circle under people's nose, right? And so we want to kind of try and avoid that if we can in wildlife as well. And so going out during those heavy overcast days can be really effective. Open shade is also great. So if we find ourselves at a zoo or a sanctuary that has overhangs and such, and it's still a bright and sunny day, when the wildlife is under those overhangs, all of that light is still bouncing back into where the wildlife is. So you have these nice open shade spaces. So it almost seems diffused, but instead it's just kind of in pockets, and we're just looking for where that pocket is specifically. Side light. So side light is going to give us something more contrasty and more dynamic. So more at early morning hours and late afternoon hours, we're going to get a bit more of that golden light. And so it can kind of create some different depth within our picture because the light's coming from a specific direction. Okay, so this is our side light. And then our backlight. Backlight we want to be careful with. We want to make sure that we are still exposing properly for, like in this case, the wolf. We want to expose properly for their eyes and for their nose and for their ears, but we still have that nice kind of rim light, that trim light that's there on the top, right? So all lighting situations to look out for. All right, so now I want to talk a little bit about the maybe a little bit more technical side of things. We're not going to get deeply into our shutter speeds, apertures, and ISOs, but we're going to cover them just a little bit so we make sure that we are all on the same page. Because again, the better we know, not just our wildlife, but the better we know our cameras and our location, the better pictures we can make, right? So we need to think about thinking photographically. What is our camera doing and how can I control it manually to make sure that I can make the best photographs? When we put our cameras into auto mode, all the camera is doing is going through a whole bunch of algorithms to try and pick what's going on in your brain. It's trying to guess, and it can't. And you are a whole lot smarter than your camera, I promise, right? So if we can control our camera manually, we can choose our shutters, apertures, and ISOs. We're going to be able to control the outcome of that picture, right? The great thing about digital now is that you can take a bazillion photographs and it's okay. You don't have to worry about running out of film necessarily. So you can really take your time learning those skills. And like we said in the beginning, that's kind of the point of going to a zoo, is to hone in those skills. So when we think about photographing wildlife, we break it down between our shutters, apertures, and ISOs. And a lot of times I'm starting with my shutter speed. I need to ask myself the question, Am I freezing motion or am I showing motion? Okay, so if I want to freeze whatever is moving, whether that's a turtle or a lion or a seal or sea lion, I don't remember how to tell the two. I know somebody in here knows how to tell me. I'm in California. I should know this. I've been told it a million times and I forget, but I know there's a very specific difference in their ears and in their eyes of how to tell which one's a sea lion and which is a seal. But anyway, we'll come back to that. Talking about shutter speed, if I am trying to freeze motion, I need to make sure that I'm choosing a number, choosing a speed that is going to freeze whatever speed the subject is moving in, right? So back to that turtle here. Oops, nope, that was not the right way. Back to the turtle. This was photographed at 1/60th of a second because he's really not moving that quickly. So I don't need something super fast. Now, while this lion is lying down and I still don't need something super fast, I need something fast enough to catch his smaller movements. The smaller movements it's still movement, right? And I still want to be able to freeze that. So this was photographed at a 2/50th of a second. This was a 500th of a second, a 2,000th of a second, and then a 2,500th of a second. And being this fast allows me to catch those smaller details. So those little drops of water that are falling off of his beak, right, out of his bill. I want to make sure that I can freeze that water, right? And so I need a fast shutter speed to be able to do that. And really all this takes is practice, right? It's practicing to know that when I'm at a 2,500th of a second, I'm going to be able to freeze certain movements compared to when I'm at a 60th of a second, I would not have been able to freeze this movement, right? And so all of this information you're just kind of banking so that when you go to the space the next time, you have more of an experience with those numbers to not have to photograph the same scene at every single shutter speed so that you know what you're doing. You'll be able to go right to that shutter speed, okay? Well, on the opposite end of the spectrum, sometimes I want to show that motion. Sometimes I don't want to freeze it. In this case, I wanted to show a little bit of the movement of this baby monkey or this baby gorilla, because he was having so much fun. And part of our images is to evoke emotion and to show something a little bit more dynamic. And so by using a little bit slower of a shutter speed and moving around with him, or trying to, because he was moving very quickly and very erratically, it helped me show a little bit of that motion. And I wasn't purposely trying to freeze it all. So these were photographed at 1/25th of a second, which if I wanted to freeze them would be way too slow. I would probably want to be at about a 500th of a second or higher to make sure that I was freezing them. But I wanted to get a little bit of that motion in there, even if it was just the motion of the leaves themselves. That way it had a little bit more depth to it, basically. Um, the general rule of thumb, which some of you may have heard when trying to choose a shutter speed, is based on your focal length. So if I am trying to freeze motion, let's say I am using the 150 to 500 and I'm out at 500 millimeters, technically the rule of thumb is that you want to be at 1 over the focal length. So 1 over 500, which is 1/500th of a second, to be able to freeze that motion. Now, so many lenses and so many camera bodies have vibration compensation, vibration control. That way, it can help us handhold at slower shutter speeds. So you could possibly be able to get away with some lower shutter speeds and still freeze that motion, depending on what lens and camera you have. Okay, so we've talked a bit about shutter speed. I want to talk a little bit about aperture as it pertains to wildlife. Our aperture does two very important things. One being that it allows us to control how much light we're letting in through our lens. Okay. And the other is that it controls our depth of field. So if I am using the lower numbers in my aperture, f5.6, f4, f2.8, f2, f1.8, those lower numbers, the lower I go, the more shallow my depth of field is going to become. Okay, so that's how I get those nice creamy backgrounds, right? So this was shot with the 70 to 200 millimeter lens, and at 2.8, I could make sure that he was all in focus, or she was all in focus, but my background had that really nice creamy bokeh in the background so that my subject was truly my focal point and that the background wasn't distracting. Okay. But what I want to watch out for when I am doing things like that, this was shot at f3.5. If I want to, if my focal planes are going to be really shallow, they're going to be really compressed. So in this case, photographing at f3.5, the camel's eye was in focus, but his nose was not because they're just distant enough from each other that they're on two different focal planes. So I need to ask myself in my picture, what do I want in focus? If I want his whole face in focus, I need to make sure that I'm boosting up that aperture. I might need to be at f8 or f11 or f16. I might need to be at a higher aperture to create that depth. But if I'm okay with making his eye the focal point and his nose a little bit blurred out, because that's on a different focal plane, I can drop down my aperture to f4, f3.5, 2.8, whatever your lens will allow. Okay. Now again, our aperture does two different things. One, we talked about our depth of field, and the other is to control our light, how much light we're letting in through our lens. And a lot of times we end up in situations at a zoo or a sanctuary or aquarium where we're in low light situations. So I might have to drop down my aperture to let in all of that light. Okay. And in this case, this was photographed with the 150 to 500 at f6.3. So I was letting in the max amount of light that I could. Now, our ISO is that third piece to the exposure triangle puzzle, and that tends to be the piece that gets chosen last. And it's not that it's less important than the other two. It is just as important as the other two, but it's going to help us balance out those other two. So it's the piece that kind of gets thought of as the last piece to the puzzle. Our ISO is, we are controlling that ISO based on how sensitive I want to make my sensor to light. So my sensor is the brain of my camera that exists on the inside, right? And I want to make that sensor more or less sensitive to light based on how much light I have available. So if I've exhausted the other two options, if I'm at f2.8 and that's the lowest my lens can go, and if I'm using a longer shutter speed, but I still want to freeze motion, I can boost up my ISO to make sure that I can still use a fast enough shutter speed to freeze the motion. So in this case, with it being at 1200 for an ISO, I can then still be at f6.7, let in light there, but be at a 200th of a second, which might seem like a little slow, but in this case, I was able to still freeze that motion, right? So it's really just about that balance. Now, there's not a lot of situations where I tell any of my students that I'm okay with them shooting automatic in anything. I tend to be a big proponent for shooting in manual, but there are certain features that can be really helpful, especially when we're out in these places where the wildlife is moving quickly and the scene is changing quickly. We have a lot of things that we have to balance, right? And so auto ISO is one of those features that can really help us in the long run because if we're already controlling our shutter speed and our apertures, the last thing I want to do is try and rack my ISO if I'm out following these birds around and I'm in a specific situation where I have dark and light patches, right? So you can see in the background there, it's a little bit darker, and over to the left, it was actually a lot darker. This was kind of the one little light patch that they landed in, which was great. But as they're flying in and out of these dark and light patches, I need my camera to try and keep up with me in certain ways. And so using auto ISO can be really helpful. But what I would suggest is to make sure that you put a minimum and a maximum on there. So make sure you set that in your camera because if you don't set a minimum or a maximum, it's going to use whatever it has, the highest it possibly has, which the resolution on it can get pretty grainy and noisy, right? So you just want to make sure that with your specific camera, based on how comfortable you are with the ISOs, if I'm comfortable with my ISO being at 64,000 and I don't see a lot of grain, great. Maybe that's where I want to put my maximum setting, right? That way my camera knows it can't go past that. Okay. Okay. So we've talked about a lot of the technical stuff. We have talked about some lenses, and controlling our or evoking emotion in our images is our main goal. And one of the greatest ways to do that is through not just understanding our light, like we talked about earlier, but understanding our composition and how to use all of these puzzle pieces in our picture to our advantage to show the viewer what we saw, right? So we always want to make sure that our image has a very specific focal point. There's a difference between an intended focal point and an actual focal point. Okay. So we're not in a classroom where I can physically make somebody stand up so I can show you this in person. So I'm going to try and describe it virtually. But in this case, we'll use these bats as an example. Again, there's a difference between an actual focal point and an intended focal point. So with these bats, the ones in the front there, those are my actual and intended focal point. They match up. That's exactly where I wanted my focal point to be and where everyone's eyes naturally go, the first place in the picture. So it turned out to be my actual focal point. But let's say I had another bat right behind him on the top left that was really bright, right? Or his eyes were facing me, right? That would have ended up being my actual focal point when I wanted this bat to be my actual focal point. Okay. So if I intended for this guy, it still might not have worked out that way. Psychologically, our brains, we always go towards the brightest spot in our frame. We always look for the eyes. We look for writing. So if we're doing street photography and we see a bunch of street signs, right? We look for writing. All of those things tend to be the first thing that we go towards in a picture. So knowing that, I want to make sure that I'm using that to my advantage to guide my viewer's eye to where I intend for that actual focal point to be. Okay. Now, one of the ways to help with that is by using leading lines. Leading lines are these guiding lines that help move our viewer's eye throughout the picture so that we help get them there, right? So this line of the flamingo's neck and even the lines of the back of his body and the side of his body, all of those lines help bring our viewer's eye into the eye of the flamingo, right? So these leading lines really help get us there. And there's no rule saying that there has to just be one leading line, and it doesn't have to be the yellow brick road. It can be made out of light. It can be made out of motion. It can be made out of movement, or yeah, motion and movement. It can be made out of all of these things. So just be aware of where they are in your picture. Scale. Scale, I think, is the puzzle piece in composition that gets forgotten the most. And I think that's because we were there, we were in the scene. We know how big or how small what we are photographing actually is. So if I'm standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon, I know how big it is because I'm there staring at it. But trying to show somebody that picture later on, sometimes it's really difficult. So if we keep things in our picture that our brains naturally know how big or how small they are, like in this case, the bucket in the background, that helps bring in scale to my picture. It helps my viewer understand measurement. If I'm standing out at the Grand Canyon, if I have people walking across the rim of the Grand Canyon, great. My brain naturally knows how big a person is, so it's going to help my viewer understand the measurement of the scene in that picture. Okay. I also want to think about always being or trying to be, in specific cases, eye level to the wildlife that I'm photographing. When you photograph wildlife from above or from below, it offers a very different dynamic. So unless that's the specific kind of power play that you are going for in that picture, you want to try and be as eye level to them as possible because you have a much deeper connection with them and the viewer has a much deeper connection with them when you do. Okay. Um, we also want to think about filling or not filling our frame. So a lot of times, I know we talk about this a lot in our macro classes. With macro photography, we tend to want to fill our frame with the entirety of that in this case, the butterfly, right? We want to fill that frame completely. But that's not necessarily always how I'm going to tell the best story of that particular subject. And not saying that it's wrong. It just depends on what the situation is, what the story you're trying to tell in the picture. But sometimes it tells a better story when you take a step back a little bit and get more of the environment in there and make sure that the environment is a part of the story as well. Okay, so the ever daunting question of photographing through fences. It is really way simpler than we think it is. It is not super hard, I promise. I'm going to give you a couple settings that make it super easy, and you can take them out in the field and go from there and experiment. But how many of us have gotten into situations where we want to take a great picture of the wildlife that is in our vicinity, but we can't because there's a giant fence in front of us? Now, I really want that fence there because as much as I think wolves are brilliant, I don't really want, I don't think it's a good idea for me to be near them. So the fence is a great idea. But to be able to photograph through them, here are your tips. First, we are going to get our camera as close to the fence as possible. Now, I know sometimes that's not super easy because there's like a moat or something between you and the fence line, or there's a kind of just an extra space in between you and the fence line, so you can't physically get there. But if you can, get your camera as close to the fence as possible. Lower your aperture. So you want a lens that is capable of f4, f2.8, f1.8, so those lower apertures. That way you're creating that shallow depth of field. You want to use a telephoto lens so that you can get greater compression, so we can compress that fence out of there, basically. And in certain cases, manual focus might be your best friend, depending on which lens and camera combo you have to help you control it best. But that's just trial and error, okay? So with all of those 4 tips, those should help you be able to photograph through a lens. Like I said, I promise it is not as scary as it sounds, but use those 4 tips and let me know how it goes, because those should help you fix the problem. Okay. And lastly, before we get to some questions, I wanted to leave some time at the end for some questions. Um, be patient with what you're photographing. Photograph through the movement, photograph through time and through whatever movement and moment is happening, because that moment is never going to happen exactly the same again. And so if we can keep our cameras on continuous shutter, if we can photograph through that motion, the littlest bits of movement are going to make a really big difference in our pictures, right? So this picture and the next 2 that I'm going to show you were all shot within just a couple of minutes of being in the same space. So I do really encourage you to spend time with what you're photographing and get to know it really well. And watch, just watch, just enjoy what's going on there. Because as you do, the more you do that, the better photographs you're going to take, because the more opportunity you are going to have for the wildlife to tell you what it wants to tell you and not to create something that isn't there. Okay. And lastly, please remember to have fun. I mentioned this at the beginning, but I know that we get caught up and wrapped up in it sometimes. So please remember to have fun and enjoy yourselves. And that being said, this is our field services team on social media. You can find us on Facebook and on Instagram. Instagram doesn't let you change your handle for a very long time, so it's still our older title, which was the Tamron Tech Team. But Facebook has been changed over to Tamron Field Services Specialist, which is our new title. Please go ahead and give us a follow, find us on social. And I put up the rebate as a reminder for us to chat about. Do you want to do questions first, or you want to chat about rebate first?
I'll just get the rebate info out of the way.
Yeah.
So if you didn't know already, Gary will be offering a bunch of specials on Tamron lenses through Hunts. So contact him if you're interested in purchase anything. But above and beyond that, Tamron is offering some consumer rebates in addition to our national instant savings that are running. So 3 different ways, opportunities to save some money if there's any lenses that are of interest to you. The bonus rebates that are associated with this presentation are only valid for a week. So make sure you give Gary a call or an email before the 11th to make your purchase. Yeah, beyond that, the only other thing I have to say is that sea lions have external ear flaps
Thank you. I knew
and
somebody would know.
the ability to rotate their hind flippers to walk on.
Oh, brilliant. All right.
I
Thanks,
had to
dude.
look that up.
Thank you. I needed that. I've seen it a million times. I don't know why I can't retain that information, but every time I see them, I forget. I'll call you next time I need to know.
There you go.
So yeah, so if anybody has any questions, you can either put them directly into the chat, or if you see down on the bottom of your screen, there's a little heart that says react. You can raise your hand. That'll let us know you have a question. While we're waiting for that, I just wanted to say, Erica, I know we talked a little bit before we kind of brought everybody else on, and that I am even beginner photographer, I feel like stretches my capabilities at the moment. But I will say what I've loved was your tip about finding the light using the back of your hand. I think that's just such a practical tip, but something that may be so simple that we kind of look past it, you know. But I know that's going to help me a lot. And so just thank you so, so much for that. Um,
You're welcome. That makes me really happy. I'm glad.
yeah, absolutely. Oh, and some of the pictures were just incredible. And then also everybody, so like I was saying too, I'll send out a wrap-up email to everybody. We'll have the video included. I'll have the attachment for the Tamron rebates that'll have there. And then I will also put a link to Tamron's Facebook and Instagram in there. So if you don't want to try to find it yourself, don't worry. Just wait for the email that I'll send you, and I'll have those linked, and you'll just be able to click them and find them real easily. Well, I tell you what, we have some thank yous coming in. But if anybody doesn't have a question, and of course, too, the other thing is I will CC Erica, Andrew, as well as Gary Farber, who's not here. I'll CC all of them on that email. So again, maybe if you're like me, it seems like as soon as the presentation ends, I think, oh, I had a question I didn't think of. We'll all be CC'd on it, so you can reach out to us if a question comes up maybe after we get off. But yeah, Sarah Danville says, great job. Jill, amazing, great job. And I could not agree more. Um, and so with that, if we don't have any questions, you guys always ask at the very end. You look down in the bottom left where it says audio. Please click on that. Please unmute yourself. And please thank Erica. Tell her what a wonderful job she did. Please thank Andrew for help getting this together. And then, yeah, just again, thank you for helping further our mission here at Tucson Bird Alliance. We are here to inspire people to protect and enjoy birds. We do that through a variety of ways. One of them is through these virtual presentations and photography to help inspire you and make you more confident to go out there, do photography on your own. And again, whatever we can do to spark those people's passions, that's what we're here for. So thank you so much to Erica Robinson. Thank you to Andrew Martin. Thank you to Tamron. Thank you to Hunt's Photo and Video. And thank you, everybody, for being here this afternoon or morning. But now I think we're almost all in the afternoon now. But yeah, so again, thank you all so much. Yeah, Andrew, I don't know if you can see it, but a lot of thank yous coming into the chat, a lot of really nice compliments. So again, thanks everybody for being here. Thanks, Erica. Thanks, Andrew. Everybody have a wonderful, wonderful afternoon.
You bet. You too.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Happened?